Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the sprawling, chaotic and often glorious story of American Airlines. Picture a fragile biplane, its wings made of fabric and wood, bucking against the wind over some forgotten field. The pilot isn't carrying vacationers, he's carrying sacks of mail and he's praying the engine doesn't quit. This is where it all begins. It's a story of ambition so big it reshaped the sky, though let's be honest, it's also a story of an industry where your luggage probably won't survive the connection, let alone a 90-year corporate history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love seeing where everyone is listening from, so feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The company we know as American Airlines wasn't born. It was assembled, stitched together like a patchwork quilt from the scraps and remnants of failed dreams. In the 1920s, aviation was less an industry and more a dangerous hobby for daredevils. The real money wasn't in flying people, who in their right mind would pay to sit in a freezing open-air cockpit. It was in flying the mail. The US Post Office, eager to get letters from New York to California faster than a steam train, began offering lucrative contract airmail routes. This sparked a frantic, unregulated gold rush. All over the country, small aviation outfits popped up, dozens of them, each one little more than a charismatic ex-WWI pilot, a rickety biplane, and a muddy field they called an airport. We're talking names now lost to history: Robertson Aircraft Corporation, Colonial Air Transport, Southern Air Transport, Embry-Riddle. By 1930, a massive holding company called the Aviation Corporation, or AVCO, had been formed to just buy them all. It swooped in and acquired a staggering 82 of these tiny, competing, and often bankrupt airmail carriers, rolling them all under one corporate umbrella. This new entity was named American Airways, but it wasn't an airline. It was a scheduling nightmare. It was less a fleet and more a flying yard sale. You had one guy flying a Pitcairn mail wing over Ohio, another in a Ford Trimotor over Texas, both probably held together with optimism and leftover stitching. The pilots were a motley crew of barnstormers, accustomed to navigating by looking out the window for landmarks. This was the era of contact flying. There was no radar, no pressurized cabins, and precious few instruments. Pilots famously followed railroad tracks, the iron compass, and rivers to find their way. If the weather turned sour, standard procedure was to drop down low, find a farmer's field and just land, sometimes waiting for days for the fog to lift. It was so common that some farmers, in a gesture of goodwill, began painting the names of their towns on the roofs of their barns, just to help these lost aviators figure out where on earth they'd ended up. Into this aerial circus steps the man who would truly forge the airline, Cyrus Rowlett Smith, known to everyone as CR. He was a Texan, an accountant by trade who had come up through Southern Air Transport, one of the companies AVCO had swallowed. Smith was not a romantic, he was not a pilot. He looked at this chaos and saw spreadsheets. He saw inefficiency. He was basically the first guy to look at a plane and think, I can optimize the cost per seat mile of this thing. His big break came with a government scandal. In 1930, the Postmaster General, Walter Folger Brown, held a meeting that became known as the Spoils Conference. Brown essentially decided that the current mail system, with its myriad tiny carriers, was inefficient. He wanted a few big airlines. So, he strong-armed the industry, using the mail contracts as a weapon, and forced the creation of the Big Four transcontinental carriers. United got the northern route, TWA got the central route, and American Airways, thanks to its collection of southern operators, was handed the lucrative southern route. Historians still debate whether C.R. Smith was a visionary consolidator who saved the industry from chaos, or simply a ruthless monopolist who benefited from cosy government deals at the Spoils Conference. What's not in debate is what he did next. In 1934, in the wake of the scandal, the government mandated that holding companies like AVCO be broken up. Smith seized the opportunity. He took control of the newly independent American Airways, immediately renamed it American Airlines, and moved the headquarters from New York to Chicago. His first job was to tame the chaos. He was obsessed with standardization. He didn't want 82 different ways of flying. He wanted one, the American way. He invested heavily in training, in maintenance protocols, and in creating a unified brand. But he had a massive, deafening and bone-chillingly cold problem. The planes were awful. To fly as a passenger in the early 1930s was an endurance test. The flagship of many fleets was the Ford Trimotor, an all-metal beast nicknamed the Tin Goose. It was revolutionary for its time, but it was also a torture chamber. The uninsulated metal fuselage vibrated so violently that the noise was deafening, requiring pilots and passengers to shout at each other or pass notes. It was freezing cold at altitude, with tiny ineffective heaters that usually just pumped out engine fumes. And it was slow, cruising at a sluggish 100 miles per hour. American's primary passenger plane was the Curtiss Condor, a lumbering biplane that was, by 1934, already an antique. It was slow, inefficient, and passengers hated it. Smith knew you couldn't build a premium brand when your customers arrived at their destination deaf, frozen, and airsick. He was already dreaming of a future where flying wasn't a stunt, where it could be comfortable, reliable, and, most importantly, profitable. He didn't just want to fly mailbags, he wanted to fly businessmen, families, and movie stars. But the plane that could do that, it didn't exist. The aviation industry was building planes for mail routes or for bare-bones passenger service, but not for luxury. If C.R. Smith wanted his new airline to dominate, he realized he would have to invent the future himself. He picked up the phone and made a call to another ambitious man named Donald Douglas, setting in motion a gamble that would either bankrupt his new company or change the world forever. C.R. Smith didn't just call Donald Douglas, he effectively threw down a gauntlet. On the other end of the line, Douglas was a brilliant, notoriously cautious engineer. His company was just starting to see success with its new DC-2, a 14-seat plane that was already making waves with TWA. Smith, in his blunt Texan manner, told Douglas the DC-2 was a fine plane, but it wasn't what he needed. It was too small. It couldn't comfortably make the coast-to-coast sleeper run, and critically it struggled to take off from some of the hot and high airfields on America's southern route, especially on just one engine. Smith wasn't asking for an upgrade. He was demanding an entirely new aircraft, built to his exact and frankly unreasonable specifications. He wanted a flying hotel. It had to be larger, wider, and capable of carrying 14 sleeping berths, real beds, not just reclining seats, so passengers could leave New York in the evening and wake up fresh in Los Angeles. This was the dream of transcontinental luxury. More than that, it needed to be powered by the new, more powerful Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines. And here was the kicker. It had to have such incredible performance that it could take off from any airport on American's route at full weight after one of its two engines had failed. Donald Douglas balked. The request was absurd. The engineering challenges were immense. He told Smith that the development costs would be astronomical, likely over $300,000, a colossal sum in 1934, equivalent to over $6 million today. He flatly stated that his company couldn't possibly absorb that kind of cost for a plane that only one airline wanted. Smith didn't flinch. He replied with one of the biggest gambles in corporate history. He said, "Fine, how much to build just one?" When Douglas gave him the price, Smith essentially said, "We'll take 20. He promised to buy 20 of these non-existent planes, fronting a massive portion of the development cost. It was a bet-the-company move. If this new plane failed, American Airlines would almost certainly go bankrupt. Reluctantly, Douglas agreed. He put his best engineer, Arthur E. Raymond, in charge of the project. The design that emerged from the Santa Monica factory was revolutionary. It was called the Douglas Sleeper Transport, or DST. It was the first plane truly designed with the passenger in mind. The fuselage was wide and barrel-shaped, not a narrow tube. It was quiet thanks to extensive soundproofing. But the real genius was structural. The team perfected the stressed skin monocoque design, where the aluminum skin itself carried the aerodynamic loads, held together by thousands of newly invented flush-head rivets. This meant the outside of the plane was perfectly smooth, with no drag-inducing rivet heads sticking out, making it incredibly strong and aerodynamically slick. The DST first flew on December 17, 1935, exactly 32 years to the day after the Wright brothers' first flight. The 14-berth sleeper was an immediate sensation, but it was the plane's other configuration that would change the world. Raymond and his team quickly realized that if you took the beds out, you could fit 21 comfortable, wide seats. This version was simply called the Douglas Commercial 3, or DC-3. This is the plane that made air travel profitable. Before the DC-3, no airline in history had ever made money just by flying passengers. The industry was propped up entirely by government airmail contracts. The old Ford Trimeters and Curtiss Condors were so inefficient that even with every seat full, they still lost money on every flight. The mail subsidies were the only thing keeping the lights on. The DC-3 shattered that reality. Its combination of speed, cruising at nearly 200 mph, reliability, and its 21-seat capacity, a 50% jump over the DC-2, created the magic formula. For the first time, an airline's passenger ticket revenue could actually exceed its operating costs. C.R. Smith's gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. He had accidentally funded the invention of the first true profitable airliner. Aviation historians still argue whether C.R. Smith truly envisioned the 21-seat dayplane configuration that made the DC-3 a legend, or if he was just narrowly focused on his luxury sleeper plane and stumbled into the profitable model by accident. But the result was undeniable. American immediately standardized its entire fleet, replacing its motley collection of older planes with a gleaming all-metal fleet of DC-3s. The impact was immediate and profound. The DC-3 was tough, famously described as a collection of parts flying in loose formation. Its landing gear could handle rough, unpaved fields, and its engines were so reliable that pilots fell in love with it. It was so well designed that its influence is still seen today. In fact, a popular quirk of aviation trivia is that some DC-3s, manufactured in the 1930s and 40s, are still in commercial service in remote parts of Alaska, Canada, and South America. They are the zombies of the aviation world refusing to die, hauling cargo and passengers nearly a century after they were built. For American, the DC-3 wasn't just a plane, it was a marketing weapon. The airline began painting the word flagship on the nose of every single one. Flying American wasn't just a trip anymore, it was an event. Passengers would board on a red carpet. The pilots, with their crisp uniforms, looked like naval captains. And for the first time, American introduced a new kind of crew member, one designed entirely for passenger comfort, the stewardess. C.R. Smith had created the machine that could make money, and now he was about to create the service that would define an entire era of travel. That new crew member, the stewardess, became the public face of the flagship fleet. American, taking a cue from United's Sky Girls, refined the role into an icon of glamour and service. These women weren't just servers, they were hostesses, nurses, and brand ambassadors, all wrapped in a crisp, military-inspired uniform. The selection process was famously, and by modern standards, absurdly strict. Applicants had to be registered nurses, under 25, weigh less than 120 pounds, be no taller than 5'4", and of course be single. Their training, run by the formidable Hazel Brooks, was less about safety procedures, which were still charmingly primitive, and more about etiquette, passenger psychology, and how to serve a full, hot meal with a smile while rattling through turbulence. This focus on the passenger experience was C.R. Smith's obsession, and it extended beyond the plane itself. In 1939, American opened the first ever private airline lounge at New York's LaGuardia Airport. It was called the Admiral's Club. The origin story, which is almost certainly a polished bit of corporate mythology, claims that Smith was waiting for a flight and saw one of his most loyal customers, a very important person, simply sitting on a bench with everyone else. He felt this was unacceptable. He supposedly sketched the idea for an exclusive club on a napkin, a quiet, comfortable place where his admirals, the name he'd given to his best customers, could relax, have a drink, and feel superior to the rabble. It was essentially the invention of the "we're better than you" lounge, and it was a stroke of marketing genius. It cost nothing to run but built a fierce, almost fanatical loyalty among the business travellers who held the keys. The flagship was now a complete ecosystem. You were chauffeured to the airport, whisked through the Admiral's Club, escorted onto the gleaming DC-3 via a red carpet, and doted on by a stewardess who probably had more medical training than the doctor in your small town. In the air, you weren't handed a sad bag of peanuts. You were served a meal. We're talking china plates, real silverware, and cocktails. Passengers on the flagship Sky Sleeper from New York to Los Angeles would board in the evening, be served a full-course dinner, and then retire to their private berth. The stewardess would convert the seats into a comfortable bed with fresh linens. They'd wake up the next morning, having crossed the entire continent, to the smell of fresh coffee and a hot breakfast just before landing in California. Remember the bone-rattling, unheated tin goose from just a few years prior? This was a different universe. This was civilization. American was at the absolute zenith of its prestige. And then the world went to war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed everything, instantly. The airline industry, this nascent symbol of luxury, was nationalized overnight. C.R. Smith, ever the patriot and smart businessman, called the White House and offered his entire fleet and all his personnel to the war effort. He was commissioned as a colonel and later rose to major general in the Army Air Forces. The airline itself was effectively folded into the Military's Air Transport Command, ATC. The gleaming flagships were stripped of their paint, their plush seats, and their kitchens. The iconic DC-3s were given a coat of olive drab, a reinforced floor, and a new name, the C-47 Skytrain. The very planes that had served champagne and steaks were now hauling paratroopers, ammunition, and medical supplies. Americans' pilots, arguably the best trained in the world, were now flying the most dangerous routes on Earth. They flew the Hump, the treacherous high-altitude supply line over the Himalayas from India to China, where the weather was so violent and the mountains so high that survival was a coin flip. It's a mainstream historical fact that nearly half of the entire US domestic airline fleet was drafted into military service. Americans' core business, the Southern Transcontinental route, became a vital artery for the ATC, shuttling men and material to the Pacific Theatre. This period was brutal, but it inadvertently secured Americans' future. The war acted as a massive government-funded R&D program. Four-engine technology, perfected in bombers like the B-24, led directly to a new generation of airliners. Radar, pressurized cabins, and advanced navigation all matured at a blistering pace. When the war ended in 1945, C.R. Smith returned from his military service to an airline that was, in technological terms, a decade ahead of where he'd left it. He immediately placed orders for new planes based on this technology, the Douglas DC-4, and soon after, the pressurized DC-6. The post-war boom was explosive. A generation of soldiers, sailors, and airmen returned home, many of whom had seen the world for the first time. The country was prosperous, and the public was no longer afraid of flying. They were fascinated by it. And American Airlines was perfectly positioned to capitalize on it. They repainted their planes, reinstalled the luxury, and hired a new generation of stewardesses. They dominated the key domestic routes. Their brand was synonymous with quality. Their operational expertise, honed by the military, was unmatched. Airline analysts still debate whether Americans' post-war dominance was a direct result of its superior flagship service and brilliant marketing, or simply a byproduct of its superior government-granted routes and the C-47's wartime reliability. It was, in all likelihood, a perfect fusion of all three. They were the premium carrier. TWA, backed by the eccentric Howard Hughes, was glamorous but erratic. United was solid but lacked American's flair. Eastern was focused on the East Coast. American was the flagship of the nation. As the 1940s closed and the 1950s dawned, C.R. Smith stood atop an empire of silver, planes. But a new sound was beginning to echo from experimental airfields, not the familiar thrum of propellers, but a high-pitched, terrifying whine. The jet age was coming, and it would demand another all-or-nothing bet. The high-pitched whine that C.R. Smith and the rest of the industry heard was coming from across the Atlantic. The British, with their de Havilland Comet, were the first to gamble on jet-powered passenger travel, launching service in 1952. The Comet was beautiful, futuristic, and eerily quiet inside. It was also a death trap. In a series of horrifying high-altitude disintegrations, the comets began to fall from the sky. The cause, eventually traced to metal fatigue originating from the plane's square windows, was a brutal lesson in a new and unforgiving aerodynamic regime. The entire Comet fleet was grounded, leaving the world's airlines terrified. The jet age seemed to have crashed and burned before it even truly began. Back in America, Smith was doubling down on what worked. He was presiding over the golden age of the propliner. His fleet of DC-6s, and by 1953, the new Douglas DC-7, were the undisputed kings of the sky. The DC-7 7Cs was the pinnacle of piston engine technology. It was so powerful it could finally fly non-stop from New York to Los Angeles against the prevailing headwinds, a feat that had eluded even the mighty DC-6. American's Mercury service was the benchmark for coast-to-coast luxury. Life was good, profits were stable. But across the country in Seattle, a company known for building massive bombers, the B-47 and the B-52, was taking its own gamble. Boeing, having watched the Comet's failure, was quietly funding its own jet prototype, the 360-780, known simply as the Dash 80. It was a private venture, costing the company $16 million of its own money, a sum that could have bankrupted them. C.R. Smith was deeply skeptical. He, like most of the Big Four CEOs, saw jets as wasteful, noisy, and unproven. They were gas guzzlers, burning fuel at a rate that made his accountants physically ill. His new DC-7s were a known, profitable quantity. Why leap into this terrifying unknown? But his rivals were sniffing around. Juan Trippe, the swashbuckling CEO of Pan Am, was already in deep talks with Boeing. Howard Hughes at TWA was famously obsessed with speed. The moment that perhaps changed Smith's mind, or at least the moment that has become legend, occurred on August 7, 1955. Boeing was demonstrating the Dash 80 to a crowd of airline executives, including Smith, who were in town for an industry conference. They watched from a boat on Lake Washington. Boeing's chief test pilot, Alvin Tex Johnston, a man who famously wore cowboy boots even in the cockpit, decided to give them a show. In a completely unauthorized, jaw-dropping display of confidence, he eased the massive, swept-wing prototype into a perfect, slow barrel roll over their heads. And then, just to prove it wasn't a fluke, he did it again. Down on the boat, the airline executives were stunned into silence. Legend has it a furious Boeing president, Bill Allen, turned to a colleague and asked for his heart pills, but the message was sent. This wasn't a fragile experimental toy like the Comet. This thing was built like a B-52. It was strong, it was capable, and it was the future. The dam broke. In October 1955, Pan Am placed the first massive order for 20 Boeing 707s. Just weeks later, American's great rival, United, shocked the industry by placing a huge order for the other jet, the Douglas DC-8. Smith was now trapped. His entire fleet of brand new, top-of-the-line DC-7s was suddenly, horrifyingly obsolete. To do nothing was to become a flying antique shop, to be left in the dust by his competitors. He was forced to make the second great bet-the-company wager of his career. He called Boeing. American Airlines placed an initial order for 30 Boeing 707s at a cost of around $135 million. It was a sum so vast it dwarfed the DC-3 gamble. This wasn't just buying planes, it was buying an entire infrastructure. The 707 required longer, stronger runways, and needed new fuel trucks, new boarding bridges, new maintenance hangars. Pilots, accustomed to the gentle physics of propeller planes, had to be completely retrained to handle the swept-wing aerodynamics and incredible speeds, where you could cross a state line in the time it took to have a sip of coffee. Aviation experts still debate whether C.R. Smith truly believed in the jet's immediate profitability, or if he was forced into the 707 purchase by Pan Am's aggressive move, viewing it as a catastrophic but necessary defensive expenditure. His actions suggest a man trying to hedge his bet. In a famous move, he also placed an order for a new, powerful turboprop plane, the Lockheed L-188 Electra. The Electra was supposed to be the sensible jet, slower than the 707 but more fuel efficient and able to use existing runways. It would service the shorter routes while the 707s handled the glamour runs. The Electra, however, would later suffer its own series of fatal, in-flight disintegrations due to a design flaw, becoming one of American's most costly and tragic mistakes. But the 707 was magic. American launched its first transcontinental Astrojet service on January 25, 1959, just 3 weeks after Pan Am's inaugural domestic flight. The effect on the public was electric. A coast-to-coast flight that took 8 hours in a rattling DC-7 now took 5. The planes climbed high above the weather, soaring at 30,000 feet in air as smooth as glass. Inside, the cabin was so quiet you could speak in a normal voice. The Astrojet brand was pure 1950s futurism, all clean lines and space-age optimism. The jet set was born, and American, with its massive new fleet, was its primary chauffeur. The gamble had, once again, paid off. Smith had successfully navigated the single greatest technological shift in aviation history. But it came at a staggering cost. The debt the airline took on to buy the 707s and DC-8s was astronomical. It created a cycle of crippling, decade-defining capital expenditure that the industry has never escaped. Smith had secured American's dominance for another decade, but he had also shackled it to a new and relentless financial master. The age of glamour had arrived, but its price tag was terrifying. And soon, Smith himself would be gone, replaced by a new generation who would have to figure out how to pay the bill. C.R. Smith's glamour-filled Astrojet era, which had defined the 1960s, gave way to the harsh, hungover reality of the 1970s. Smith himself retired in 1968, leaving a company that was a giant but a clumsy one. The decade that followed was a brutal reckoning. The 1973 oil crisis sent fuel prices skyrocketing, shattering the economic model of the gas-guzzling 707. Stagflation gripped the nation, meaning costs were rising while demand was falling. And on the horizon was a political storm that would tear down the entire carefully constructed world the Big Four airlines inhabited: deregulation. The old cosy system where the government, through the Civil Aeronautics Board, Sabre, dictated exactly who could fly where and exactly how much they could charge, was dying. Into this impending chaos stepped a new kind of leader, a man who was the polar opposite of the pioneering, backslapping C.R. Smith. His name was Robert Crandall. Crandall was not a pilot or a romantic. He was a data-obsessed, famously profane, and relentlessly aggressive finance executive. He had started his career at Eastman Kodak, worked at TWA, and then came to American as its chief financial officer. He didn't look at the sky and see glamour. He looked at it and saw an inefficient, high-cost, poorly optimized logistics network. He saw waste, and he hated waste. He was a man who would later become a corporate legend for a single, defining decision. In the 1980s, he ordered the removal of one single olive from every salad served in first class, a move that his data correctly predicted would save the company $40,000 a year. That was Crandall. Crandall's rise to power, becoming president in 1980 and CEO in 1985, coincided with the 1978 Airline Deregulation Act. This act was the big bang for the modern airline industry. The cab was phased out. Suddenly, any airline could fly any route it wanted at any price the market would bear. It was, for the legacy carriers, a nightmare. New, non-union, low-cost carriers like Southwest Airlines, Musair, and People Express seemingly sprang from the ground, offering $49 fares on routes where American was struggling to break even. American's network was a relic of the old cab point-to-point system, a sprawling, inefficient map of direct flights that C.R. Smith had built. Crandall knew this model was dead. His revolutionary solution was to fully embrace the hub-and-spoke system. The idea was simple, but logistically massive. Instead of flying a low-demand route like El Paso to Detroit direct, you'd fly all your planes from smaller spoke cities into one massive central hub airport. Passengers would deplane, scurry to their new gates, and board a new plane to their final destination. It was, on paper, a traveller's inconvenience, turning one flight into two. But it was a network builder's dream. It allowed American to offer hundreds, then thousands, of new city pair combinations. In 1979, American had moved its corporate headquarters from New York City to Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, ostensibly to save on taxes. Crandall saw the massive new DFW airport not as a headquarters, but as a weapon. He began pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into it, building out new terminals and gates, transforming DFW into the first fortress hub. By 1981, American was routing the vast majority of its transcontinental traffic through DFW. It was a colossal, expensive bet, but it worked. Passengers in Austin or Tulsa or Oklahoma City, who once had few travel options, could now book a one-stop flight to almost anywhere in the country, as long as they flew American. But the hub was only half the solution. Crandall's other bigger problem was cost. Specifically, labour costs. Americans' pilots, flight attendants, and mechanics were the best paid, most heavily protected union workforce in the world, a legacy of the regulated high-profit glamour days. Crandall, looking at the non-union, low-wage pilots at Southwest, knew he was in a knife fight with one arm tied behind his back. He had to break the cost structure, or the airline would go bankrupt. His solution, forced through in a series of brutal 1983 contract negotiations with Americans' unions, was the two-tier wage system. It was a masterstroke of financial engineering and a devastating blow to corporate culture. The deal was this: all current employees, the A scale, would keep their high salaries, their generous pensions, and their ironclad job protections. But every single new employee hired after that date, every new pilot, every new flight attendant, every new mechanic would be on a permanent B scale. This B scale meant they would earn, in some cases, 30 to 50% less than the A scale employee sitting right next to them in the cockpit or working the same aisle in the cabin for doing the exact same job. It was a brilliantly divisive tactic. It brought Crandall immediate labour peace. The existing high seniority union members, the ones who actually voted on the contract, were happy to protect their own paychecks, effectively selling out the next generation. Crandall got the long-term cost savings he desperately needed to compete with the low-cost carriers. Analysts still debate whether the two-tier system was a masterstroke of financial acumen that saved American from bankruptcy in the brutal 1980s, or a short-sighted and cynical deal with the devil that permanently destroyed the airline's corporate culture and employee morale. The fallout was immediate and toxic. A deep, seething resentment became a permanent feature of life at American. The B-scalers felt correctly that they were second-class citizens. They had no loyalty to the company and deeply resented their A-scale colleagues. This us versus them bitterness would fester for decades, long after Crandall was gone, leading to acrimonious labour relations, poor customer service, and a workforce that often seemed to actively despise its own management. Crandall had saved the airline's balance sheet by mortgaging its soul. He had revolutionised Americans' geography with the DFW hub and its finances with the two-tier system, but he was just getting started. He had another, even more powerful weapon in his arsenal, a digital system that would allow him to not just compete, but to control the entire travel industry. He was about to weaponize the computer. Robert Crandall's mind didn't just work on a spreadsheet, it worked like a database. And it just so happened that American Airlines owned the biggest, most powerful private database in the world. It was a digital beast born from a chance encounter on a flight back in 1953, when C.R. Smith himself, the old-school pioneer, happened to sit next to an IBM salesman. Smith had complained about the reservations problem, the nightmarish, manual system of phone calls, note cards, and lazy Susan file carousels that his agents used to track and often lose, seat bookings. That conversation led to a massive joint venture, and in 1960 the birth of Semi-Automatic Business Research Environment, or Sabre. For its first 2 decades, Sabre was just a very, very good reservation system. A $40 million behemoth in 1960s money, it was the first of its kind, a centralized mainframe in Briarcliff Manor, New York, connected to thousands of terminals across the country. It could track every seat on every American flight in real time. It was an operational miracle. But to Robert Crandall, who had come from the data processing world, this was like using a supercomputer to play Pong. He saw what Sabre really was, a weapon of terrifying monopolistic potential. In the late 1970s, just before deregulation, Crandall, then the head of marketing, made a fateful push. He began an aggressive campaign to get Sabre terminals, for free or at a massive discount, onto the desk of every single independent travel agent in America. The agents, still working with phone books, teletypes, and rotating files, thought it was a miracle. With one magical screen, they could suddenly book flights, not just on American to be sure, but on every airline, plus hotels and rental cars. They embraced it by the thousands. By the early 1980s, nearly half of all travel agencies in the US were running on Sabre. This is when Crandall sprung his trap. He understood a simple, human truth. People are lazy. Travel agents, under pressure to make bookings quickly, would almost always book the first flight that appeared on the screen. So Crandall's team programmed Sabre with a legendary and deeply cynical, screen bias. When an agent typed in DFW to LAX, the Sabre system would always display American's flights first. Always. It didn't matter if a competitor's flight was cheaper. It didn't matter if it was non-stop and American's was a connection. It didn't matter if the rival flight left at a better time. American's flights, Line 1, Line 2, Line 3. Only after scrolling past a full page of AA listings would the agent find the options from TWA, Delta, or, heaven forbid, a new low-cost carrier. The effect was catastrophic for the competition. American's market share, especially in its new DFW Fortress hub, exploded. It was a license to print money. Other airlines were forced to pay American, their mortal enemy, exorbitant booking fees just to be listed in the Sabre database at all. And, even when they paid, they were buried on page 4. But the screen bias was only the first part of the weapon. The second, more insidious part was the data. Remember, all of these travel agents were using Sabre to book all of their flights. This meant that every time an agent booked a ticket on United or TWA or Delta, that booking information flowed directly into Robert Crandall's mainframe. He had, in effect, a live feed of his enemy's most sensitive commercial data. He was a digital spy master. His team at DFW could see in real time exactly how a new route from a competitor was selling. They knew to the seat what TWA's advance bookings for the Christmas holiday looked like. If Delta launched a $19 fare sale from Atlanta to Chicago, Crandall knew within hours whether it was working, whether passengers were actually buying it, or if it was a dud. He could see their load factors, their pricing strategies, and their weakest routes. Armed with this perfect real-time market intelligence, American could launch surgical predatory strikes. If Continental tried to open a new route into DFW, American would flood the market with cheap seats before Continental's first plane even took off, killing the route in its cradle. Airline economists and regulators still debate whether Sabre was a genuine technological innovation that benefited consumers by creating a one-stop shop, or a predatory, anti-competitive monopoly that suffocated smaller carriers and defined the brutal, post-deregulation landscape. The answer, of course, is that it was both. It was so effective and so blatantly anti-competitive that it sparked what became known as the CRS Wars, Computer Reservation System Wars. United, seeing what American was doing, frantically developed its own system, Apollo, and the two giants battled for the desks of travel agents. The competitive imbalance became so severe that the US government finally had to step in. In 1984, the Civil Aeronautics Board, in one of its final acts, issued rules that banned deceptive screen bias, forcing Sabre and Apollo to display flights in a more neutral order. But the damage was done and the DNA of the company was set. American was no longer just an airline. It was a data company that happened to fly planes. This data-driven mindset led directly to Crandall's next, and perhaps most enduring revolution. He had used data to optimize his hub, to crush his unions, and to control his distribution network. Now, he would use it to control the passenger himself. He was about to invent the modern loyalty program. Robert Crandall was now the master of the skies, but he knew his control was incomplete. He had the hub, he had the low-cost labour pipeline, and thanks to Sabre, he had his boot on the throat of the entire travel agency network. But he didn't have the passenger, not really. In the new, sharp-elbowed world of deregulation, the customer was a mercenary, a promiscuous shopper who would ditch American, his supposed flagship, in a heartbeat to save $20 on a flight with TWA or Braniff. This drove Crandall insane. He was spending millions on marketing to attract these business travellers, only to have them defect on their next trip. He needed a way to own them, to build a digital fence around his best customers and make it painful for them to fly with anyone else. He had the perfect tool. Sabre wasn't just a booking system, it was a massive customer database. He could track them. The idea of rewarding loyalty wasn't new. Your grandmother collected S&H green stamps to get a new toaster. But no one had ever effectively applied it to a high-cost, high-frequency, intangible product like an airline seat. In 1980, Crandall's marketing team, led by Tom Plaskett, came to him with a proposal. What if they used Sabre to track the miles each passenger flew? And what if, after a passenger flew a certain number of miles, say 12,000, they just gave them a free flight? It was, in essence, the world's most sophisticated buy 10 get one free punch card. Initially, there was heavy internal resistance. The finance department was horrified, screaming about revenue displacement. Giving away a $500 ticket for free? It was madness. It would dilute the brand and destroy profits. Crandall, the data man, saw the true genius. He didn't care about the cost of the free ticket. He knew that the average flight went out with 30% of its seats empty. The marginal cost of putting one extra person in an otherwise empty seat was almost zero. Maybe a bag of peanuts and a little extra jet fuel. But the behavioural change it would inspire was priceless. On May 1st, 1981, American Airlines launched AAdvantage. It was the first modern frequent flyer program, and it detonated in the marketplace with the force of a bomb. The public's response wasn't just positive, it was fanatical. The brilliance of AAdvantage was its deep, cynical understanding of human psychology. First, it gamified the drudgery of business travel. The travelling salesman slogging through another Monday morning flight to Cleveland wasn't just working anymore. He was earning. He was on a quest. He was accruing a new kind of currency, one that felt secret and special. Second, it tapped into the magic of spending other people's money, or OPM. The business traveller was spending their company's money on the flight, but they were earning the personal reward. They were, in effect, getting a kickback, a free vacation to Hawaii, or a trip to see their grandkids, paid for by their boss. This simple, unethical transaction was the program's secret engine. Suddenly, these business travellers, who had been ruthlessly price shopping, would now refuse to fly any other airline. They would intentionally book inconvenient connecting flights through DFW, adding hours to their travel day, just to ensure the miles flowed into their AAdvantage account. The program was so powerful, so immediately successful, that it triggered an all-out panic at Americans' competitors. United Airlines, which had been secretly developing a similar program, was forced to rush its Mileage Plus program to market just 1 week later. Delta launched its program within months. TWA and Pan Am scrambled to follow. The loyalty wars had begun, but American, by being first, had captured the crucial high-value travellers and set the terms of engagement. This led to the creation of elite tiers: Advantage Gold, Platinum, and later, the almost mythical invitation-only Executive Platinum. This was another psychological masterstroke. It wasn't just about free flights anymore, it was about status. It was the Admiral's Club, but for the sky. It gave road warriors a new class system. An Advantage Gold member got to board the plane first, got preferential treatment, and most importantly, got to feel superior to the kettles in the back. This created a generation of mileage junkies, travellers who would take mileage runs, pointless cross-country flights just to hit a status threshold. The quirky behaviour this inspired became legendary, culminating in the 1999 story of the Pudding Guy, an engineer who bought over 12,000 cups of healthy choice pudding to exploit a promotion, earning him 1.225 million frequent flyer miles for a cost of just over $3,000. But the true, world-changing genius of the program came later. When Crandall's team realised they didn't have to just give miles away, they could sell them. They launched the Advantage co-branded credit card with Citibank. This move was transformative. It turned the Advantage program from a marketing expense into a high-profit standalone business. Here's how it worked. Citibank would buy billions of miles from American at a wholesale rate, say 1.5 cents per mile. Citibank then gave those miles to its cardholders as a reward for spending 1 mile for every dollar. The consumer, now addicted to earning miles, would put everything, their gas, their groceries, their mortgage, on that credit card, all to chase the dragon of a free flight. American was now getting paid billions of dollars in pure high-margin cash, up front for a product, a mile, that it created from thin air. The liability for this shadow currency was massive, but the redemption rate was low and the profit was intoxicating. Economists still debate whether frequent flyer programs are a brilliant marketing tool that builds loyalty or a predatory, regressive shadow currency that ultimately inflates ticket prices for casual travellers. What's not in debate is that by the 1990s the AAdvantage program was more profitable than the airline itself. The business of selling miles to banks was a better, more stable business than the capital-intensive, high-risk, low-margin business of actually flying airplanes. Robert Crandall had done it. He had built an impenetrable fortress, his DFW hub, his two-tier wages, his Sabre spy network, and his AidVantage loyalty trap. He was, by the late 1980s, the most powerful and feared man in the industry. But all the data in the world can't account for metal fatigue, and a single catastrophic event in Chicago was about to shake his empire to its very foundation. Robert Crandall, by the close of the 1970s, had assembled a corporate machine of terrifying efficiency. His data-driven strategies were choking his competitors, his labour costs were on a leash, and his loyalty program was building a digital fence around his customers. He was, in short, winning. But the airline industry is not a database. It is a physical, brutal business of metal, fire, and physics. And on a beautiful spring afternoon in Chicago, the physical world reasserted itself in the most horrific way imaginable. It was Friday, May 25, 1979, the beginning of Memorial Day weekend. Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, the busiest in the world, was a hive of holiday energy. At Gate K5, American Airlines Flight 191 was boarding for a routine sold-out run to Los Angeles. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, the workhorse of American's wide-body fleet. It was a beautiful, futuristic-looking trijet with 2 engines on the wings and a third, distinctive engine mounted in the tail fin. It was the industry's answer to the 747, and 258 passengers, including a full crew of 13, settled in for the afternoon flight. The weather was clear, the winds were light. Captain Walter Lux, a 22,000-hour veteran, and First Officer James Dillard guided the 180-ton jet onto runway 32 right. They completed their final checks. The 3 massive General Electric engines spooled up to a deafening roar, and the plane began its takeoff roll. It accelerated normally, hitting its decision speed. Captain Lux called V1, then rotate. Dillard pulled back on the yoke, and the nose wheel lifted gracefully from the pavement. And then, in an instant, it all went wrong. To the horrified crowd in the airport's finger terminals, it was a sight of pure physical impossibility. As the DC-10 lifted off, its entire left engine, engine number 1, along with its massive pylon mounting, ripped clean off the wing. The 13,000-pound assembly, still at full takeoff power, cartwheeled up and over the top of the wing, smashing a section of the leading edge before hurtling down onto the runway, where it exploded in a plume of jet fuel and shrapnel. In the cockpit, the crew was blind. The separation had been so violent it severed the electrical lines that powered the captain's flight instruments, including his stall warning and his engine failure gauges. All they knew was a bone-jarring thump and a violent, uncommanded yaw to the left. The cockpit voice recorder captured their immediate professional confusion. "Damn!" one of them exclaimed. They had no idea they had lost an engine. They had no idea they were flying a mortally wounded machine. The problem wasn't just the missing engine. A 7,000-pound hole was now punched in the leading edge of their left wing. Worse, the pylon separation had also severed the hydraulic lines that powered the wing's leading edge slats, small aerodynamic surfaces that extend at low speed to provide extra lift. On the right wing, the slats remained deployed as they should be for takeoff. But on the left wing, the one that had just lost its engine, the loss of hydraulic pressure caused the slats to retract. This created a catastrophic, unrecoverable imbalance. The left wing, with its slats gone, now had a much higher stall speed than the right wing. The crew, following standard procedure for an engine-out emergency, had slowed the plane down to their V2 climbing speed. But that speed was now suicidally slow for the damaged left wing. Less than 30 seconds after it left the ground, the left wing stalled. The plane, now starved of lift on one side, snapped into an uncontrollable 112-degree bank. It was no longer flying, it was a projectile. The wings went completely vertical, then past vertical, with the nose pointed at the ground. It was completely inverted. From the terminal, witnesses watched in silent, frozen terror as the massive jet, now a silver cross against the blue sky, simply rolled over on its back and fell. Flight 191 disintegrated in a field and a small mobile home park just under a mile from the end of the runway. The fireball was so immense it was visible from downtown Chicago. All 271 people on board and 2 people on the ground were killed. It was and remains the deadliest single-plane aviation disaster in United States history. The shockwave was immediate. This wasn't a small plane in bad weather. This was a flagship carrier in broad daylight at the world's busiest airport. The FAA, facing immense public and political pressure, took the unprecedented step of grounding every single DC-10 in the United States. It was the largest grounding in aviation history. The investigation began instantly, and the focus was on the plane. The DC-10 already had a grim reputation. A faulty cargo door design had caused a catastrophic Turkish Airlines crash outside Paris in 1974, killing 346 people. The media, smelling blood, quickly nicknamed American's jet the Death Cruiser 10. The assumption was that McDonnell Douglas had built a flawed plane. Investigators and engineers still debate whether McDonnell Douglas's pylon design was inherently flawed, or if the true fault lay with the airline's unapproved maintenance procedures. The NTSB investigators, sifting through the wreckage, found the pylon's rear attachment point, and on it they found what they were looking for, a massive 10-inch long fracture. But it wasn't a design flaw, it was a fatigue crack. The metal had been stressed, over and over, until it broke. The question was, why? The answer would shatter American's reputation for maintenance excellence. The McDonnell Douglas manual for removing the engine and pylon for service was a multi-step, time-consuming process. Remove the engine from the pylon first, then remove the pylon from the wing. It was slow, and in Crandall's world, time was money. The NTSB discovered that American Airlines maintenance crews in Tulsa, along with crews at Continental, had developed an unapproved shortcut procedure. Instead of the delicate multi-step process, they were using a forklift. They would drive a forklift up to the wing, support the entire 13,000-pound engine and pylon assembly, unbolt it all at once, and lower it as a single piece. It was faster. It saved thousands of man-hours. It was also incredibly dangerous. This procedure put an immense, unintended stress on the pylon's aft attachment point, a single bolt. Over time, this stress created tiny invisible cracks. The plane that operated as Flight 191 had this exact shortcut performed on it just 8 weeks before the crash. The forklift operator had been clumsy, and the constant tiny stresses of takeoffs and landings since then had widened that crack, until on May 25th, the full throttle power of takeoff was the last straw. The metal simply gave way. For American, the finding was a corporate catastrophe. They weren't the victims of a flawed plane, they were the cause. Their data-driven, cost-saving efficiency now had a human cost: 273 lives. The airline was fined $500,000 by the FAA, the maximum allowed. The DC-10 was eventually ungrounded, its reputation forever tarnished. But for American, the damage to its brand, its flagship promise of safety and reliability, was incalculable. It was a horrifying public lesson that cutting the wrong corner in the pursuit of efficiency could lead to an abyss. The ghost of Flight 191 would haunt the airline's hangars for decades. The shadow of Flight 191 was long and dark, but in Robert Crandall's relentless data-driven world, sentiment was a luxury. The public's memory, he wagered, was short. The NTSB finding, while a brutal public relations blow, had been dealt with. The fines were paid, the maintenance procedures rewritten, and one assumes the forklifts put back in their place, and the DC-10s were flying again. By the mid-1980s, the American Airlines cash machine was back online and humming. Crandall's fortress was complete. The DFW hub was a roaring success. The two-tier wage system was saving billions in labour costs. The Advantage program was minting loyalty and cash. And the Sabre system was a digital octopus with its tentacles in every travel agency in the nation. American was, by a wide margin, the most profitable airline in the domestic market. But for a man like Crandall, domestic was now a synonym for conquered. His gaze and his ambition turned outward. The next great prize wasn't in the United States, it was across the oceans. The 1978 Deregulation Act had unleashed competition at home, but the international skies were still a relic of the old world. They were governed by a thicket of bilateral treaties, archaic agreements between nations that dictated to the letter which airlines could fly where, when, and how often. For decades, the United States had two chosen flag carriers for these routes: Pan American World Airways and Trans World Airlines, or TWA. Pan Am, the swashbuckling creation of one trip, owned the Pacific and Latin America. TWA, the former obsession of Howard Hughes, was the king of the Atlantic. These were the airlines that flew presidents and rock stars, the symbols of American glamour and global reach. By the late 1980s, however, these two titans were dying. They were poorly managed, saddled with aging fleets, and had been lethally slow to adapt to the post-deregulation world. They were wounded gazelles, and Crandall was a lion. He began by picking at the edges. He used American's domestic hub-and-spoke system as a powerful feed for new tentative international flights, a flight from Dallas to Frankfurt or Chicago to Paris. These were profitable, but they were secondary. The real prize, the undisputed crown jewel of international travel, was one single airport, London Heathrow. Heathrow, or LHR in airline code, was, and is, the most important, most lucrative, and most jealously guarded airport in the world. Its gates and landing slots were finite, controlled by treaties, and grandfathered into the hands of the legacy carriers, primarily British Airways, TWA, and Pan Am. It was the preferred destination for every high-paying business traveller on Earth. To be a true global airline, you had to fly to Heathrow. Crandall, stuck flying into the less desirable Gatwick Airport, was on the outside looking in. His opportunity came from TWA. The once proud airline was now in the clutches of corporate raider Carl Icahn, who was in the process of a leveraged buyout, a polite term for loading the company with junk bond debt and stripping it of its most valuable assets to pay himself. TWA was bleeding to death, and Icahn was selling the jewellery. Its most valuable piece was its bundle of 6 routes into London Heathrow, including the vital arteries from New York, JFK, Los Angeles and Boston. Crandall pounced. In 1990, he entered into brutal negotiations with Icahn. It was a deal of stunning audacity. Crandall didn't want the whole airline. God, no. He didn't want TWA's ancient, gas-guzzling 747s, its crippling pension obligations, or its furious, demoralised unions. He just wanted the routes. In December 1990, a deal was struck. American Airlines would pay TWA a staggering $445 million in cash for just those 6 Heathrow routes. It was an earth-shattering moment. The US Department of Transportation and the British government had to approve this unprecedented transfer of power. Pan Am and other rivals screamed, calling it a blatant anti-competitive power grab that would create a new monster carrier. They were right. It was. The deal was approved. In the spring of 1991, American Airlines planes painted in their gleaming, polished aluminum livery began touching down at Heathrow's Terminal 3. It was a public execution. TWA, shorn of its most profitable routes, was now a zombie airline doomed to a slow, pathetic demise. Pan Am, similarly weakened, would collapse entirely and cease to exist by the end of that same year. Crandall had, in one masterful, cash-heavy stroke, bought his way into the most exclusive club in the world. He had cemented American's place as a true global mega-carrier, but he wasn't done. The ink was barely dry on the TWA deal when he turned his attention south. Another giant, Eastern Airlines, was in its final death throes, collapsing in a spectacular bankruptcy. Eastern, under the leadership of Frank Lorenzo and later its bankruptcy trustee, had a massive, sprawling and highly profitable route network to Latin America, built over 50 years. In 1990, American bought that too for $349 million. This 1-2 punch was a buy-don't-build strategy on a global scale. In the span of about 18 months, Robert Crandall had bought the Atlantic from TWA and Latin America from Eastern. He had created an empire on which the sun quite literally never set. American was now the dominant US carrier to Europe and the dominant US carrier to South America. Aviation analysts still debate whether Crandall's massive purchase of TWA's LHR routes was a stroke of genius that secured American's global future, or a high-priced, ego-driven acquisition that overextended the airline just as new. More efficient long-haul planes were emerging. The airline was now, by almost any measure, the largest in the world. Its fleet was vast, its route map spanned the globe, its marketing was aggressive, with a new conquistador ad campaign for its European routes, promising to bring its signature flagship service to the old world. The hubris at the DFW headquarters, nicknamed The Crew, Crandall's ruthless executive wing, was palpable. They were the masters of the universe. They had rewritten the rules, crushed their unions, spied on their competitors, and now, bought the world. But this new global empire was built on a foundation of staggering debt, and just as Crandall was celebrating his victory, he decided to push his luck one last time back on the domestic front. He tried to simplify airfares with a new program called value pricing, a move that backfired spectacularly and triggered a bloody fare war that cost the industry billions. The company was huge, but it was now also vulnerable, and in St. Louis, the final remnants of TWA, the company he had personally dismembered, were still clinging to life. It was a piece of unfinished business that would soon become a fatal, all-consuming obsession. Robert Crandall, the architect of the modern American Airlines, finally retired in 1998. He left behind a legacy of brutal efficiency, technological dominance, and a corporate culture that was both victorious and deeply scarred. His hand-picked successor, Don Carty, inherited an empire. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s was in full swing, planes were full, and the AAdvantage program was printing money faster than the US Mint. American was the largest, most profitable, and most powerful airline on Earth. And when you're at the top of the mountain, the only thing you can think about is how to get even higher. The hubris at the DFW headquarters was absolute. There was one piece of unfinished business, one ghost still rattling its chains, TWA. The airline that Crandall had so skillfully dismembered a decade prior by buying its London routes was still, somehow, alive. It was a zombie airline. It had staggered through 2 bankruptcies in 1992 and 1995. Its fleet was a flying museum, a chaotic mix of ancient 747s, aging 767s, 757s, DC-9s, and MD-80s. Its employees were demoralised, and it was buckling under a mountain of debt. But it had one thing American coveted: a massive, dominant hub right in the centre of the country in St. Louis, Missouri. To Don Carty and his team, TWA looked like a wounded animal, a final, easy conquest that would complete their map of the United States. Owning St. Louis, STL, would give American an unassailable 3-hub wall in the nation's interior, locking down DFW in the south, Chicago O'Hare in the north, and now STL in the centre. It was a move to create a domestic fortress so impregnable that no other airline, not United, not Delta, could ever challenge it. It was, in their minds, the final move in Crandall's chess game. In January 2001, American Airlines announced its intention to buy its historic rival. The deal, which closed in April, was framed as a merciful rescue. American would pay $742 million in cash and stock for TWA's assets. But that was just the sticker price. The real cost was buried in the fine print. American would also assume $3.5 billion in TWA's crippling debt and aircraft leases. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, an acquisition born from the belief that American's invincible management team could absorb this sick, dying patient and, through sheer force of will, make it healthy. They were wrong. The integration was not just a failure, it was a slow-motion catastrophe that began the very second the deal was signed. The airline, already a giant, was now swallowing another giant, and it was choking. The first disaster was the fleet. American's pilots and mechanics were trained on a mostly streamlined fleet of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas jets. TWA's fleet was a hodgepodge. American didn't fly 757s in large numbers, nor did it fly the ancient DC-9s. It now owned hundreds of planes that its own crews couldn't fly, and its own mechanics couldn't fix without massive, expensive retraining. The complexity of stocking spare parts for 2 entirely different operational philosophies exploded. The second, and far more toxic disaster was the people. The core of any airline is its seniority list. A pilot's seniority number is everything. It dictates their pay, their plane, their routes, and their schedule. American's powerful pilot union, the APA, had agreed to the merger on one condition. The TWA pilots, despite their decades of experience, would be stapled to the bottom of American's seniority list. The result was a cultural nightmare. A 25-year TWA 747 captain, a veteran of the most demanding international routes, was suddenly junior to a 3-year American first officer flying MD-80s from Dallas to Des Moines. The TWA crews, who had been told this was a merger of equals, were betrayed, humiliated, and furious. The American crews, for their part, were arrogant and dismissive, treating the TWA veterans as charity cases. The animosity in the cockpits and crew lounges was so thick you could cut it with a knife. This wasn't a merger, it was a hostile occupation, and the occupied territory was bleeding money. TWS, even after the acquisition, was losing millions of dollars every single day. The $3.5 billion debt anchor was now chained to American's ankle, and the airline was hemorrhaging cash trying to integrate this sprawling, unprofitable and furious new appendage. The entire summer of 2001 was an operational meltdown. Flights were late, planes were grounded, and the seething resentment of the two workforces created a customer service black hole. Analysts still debate whether the TWA acquisition was a strategically sound, though poorly timed move to gain market share, or an act of pure corporate hubris that would have bankrupted American even without an external shock. The evidence points to the latter. American had stretched itself to the absolute breaking point. It was financially exposed, operationally chaotic, and culturally shattered. Don Carty had taken Robert Crandall's perfectly tuned fortress and turned it into a fragile, debt-laden and deeply unhappy house of cards. The company was stumbling, its balance sheet flashing red as the calendar turned past Labor Day. The airline was on the ropes, a bloated giant begging for a stable, profitable fourth quarter to stop the bleeding. It was in the worst possible shape at the worst possible moment in history. The date was September the 10th, 2001. The morning of September 11th, 2001 dawned with a clear, severe blue sky over the East Coast. It was a perfect day for flying. In Boston, at Logan International Airport, the crew of American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 bound for Los Angeles, was running through its final pre-flight checks. It was a routine transcontinental run, filled with business travelers, families, and people just trying to get home. A few gates away, United Airlines Flight 175 was preparing for the same route. Further south at Washington Dulles International Airport, American Airlines Flight 77, another 767 bound for LA, was boarding. For American Airlines, it was just another Tuesday. A Tuesday where the company was, as we know, financially hemorrhaging, operationally chaotic from the TWA merger, and culturally at war with itself. But the planes, as they always did, pushed back from the gates. At 7:59 a.m., Flight 11 took off from Boston. At 8:14 a.m., it was climbing through 26,000 feet when it made its last routine communication. Moments later, it stopped responding. In the airline's operations center, this was an anomaly, a worry, but not yet a terror. Then, a chilling, fragmented transmission came through on the air traffic control frequency. A voice, calm and foreign, said, "We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport." A hijacker had keyed the wrong microphone, broadcasting his announcement to the cabin to the air traffic controllers. At that same moment, a flight attendant in the back of the plane, Betty Ong, managed to get through on an airphone to American's reservation center. In a call that would last 25 agonizing minutes, she became the first voice to describe the horror. "The cockpit's not answering," she reported, her voice astonishingly level. "Somebody's stabbed in business class, and I think there's mace. I think we're getting hijacked." A few minutes later, another flight attendant, Madeline Amy Sweeney, got on the phone with a manager at Logan. "Listen to me, and listen to me very carefully," she said, before proceeding to give the seat numbers of the men who had just stormed the cockpit. These women, in the final terrifying minutes of their lives, were not panicking. They were working. They were gathering intelligence. They were the first heroes of a new war. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, the flagship that was the symbol of C.R. Smith's post-war luxury, was flown deliberately at 466 miles per hour into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The world stopped. In operation centers at American and United, sheer uncomprehending panic set in. They knew they had another hijacked plane, United 175, still in the air. At 9:03 a.m., that plane struck the South Tower, and they knew they had another one. Flight 77 out of Dulles had also gone silent. It had turned around completely over Ohio and was now a missile aimed at Washington, D.C. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, carrying 64 souls, slammed into the western face of the Pentagon. The FAA, in a move of unprecedented, desperate defense, issued a nationwide ground stop. For the first time in history, the entire American air traffic system was shut down. Every plane in the sky, thousands of them, was ordered to land at the nearest available airport. The sky, that vast, chaotic, profitable highway that American had spent 70 years conquering, was now empty, silent. For the employees of American Airlines, the day was an abyss of personal and professional grief. This wasn't an abstract attack on the nation. It was a deeply personal, intimate violation. It was their planes, their colleagues, their passengers. The 23 crew members and 139 passengers on those 2 flights were gone. The AA logo, the proud eagle, was now the lead image in the worst attack on American soil in history, a symbol of terror painted on the side of a murder weapon. The company's very identity, its flagship brand, had been corrupted. Don Carty, the CEO who had just bet the farm on the TWA acquisition, now faced an existential crisis. The airline was, as we've established, already on the brink of financial ruin. The TWA deal had stretched it to the absolute limit. Now, in the wake of the attacks, American wasn't just losing money, it was vaporizing it. With its entire fleet of over 700 planes grounded, the airline's bleed rate was estimated at over $100 million per day. No revenue was coming in. But the massive crippling costs, the new debt from TWA, the aircraft leases, the non-flying salaries, were still due. When the skies finally, tentatively reopened 3 days later, no one wanted to fly. The public was, understandably, terrified. The new normal was a catastrophic drop in passenger demand. Business travel, the lifeblood of Americans' profitability, evaporated overnight. Who wanted to get on a plane when you could just not? The airline, already suffocating from the TWA debt, was now suffocating from a total lack of revenue. The US government, realizing its entire transportation network was about to collapse, stepped in with a $15 billion bailout package called the Air Transportation Safety and System Stabilization Act. American, as one of the primary victims, was a major recipient, getting billions in cash grants and loan guarantees. But it wasn't a rescue, it was a tourniquet on a severed artery. Historians and security analysts still debate whether the 9/11 attacks were a black swan event that caused the airline industry's collapse, or simply the final pinprick that burst a bubble already inflated by deregulation, hubris, and unsustainable debt. For American, the answer was grimly clear. 9/11 was the final, fatal push. The arrogance of the TWA acquisition had loaded the gun, and the terrorists had pulled the trigger. The company was now in a desperate fight for survival. The first and most painful move was to slash costs. That meant planes, and it meant people. American began grounding its older, less efficient jets by the dozen, and in the weeks following the attack, the company announced it would lay off 20,000 employees. The two-tier wage system, the US versus them culture that Crandall had created, now became a brutal battle for scraps. The seething resentment between the legacy American crews and the newly acquired TWA crews turned into open warfare. The decade of glamour was over. A decade of pure, unmitigated decline had begun. The decade that followed September 11th was not a story of recovery. It was a story of a slow, grinding 10-year decline. It was the lost decade, a period of profound misery for an airline that had once defined American prestige. The billions in government bailout money were not a cure, they were just morphine, dulling the pain of an amputation that had already happened. The company was fundamentally broken. The post-9/11 trauma, combined with the pre-existing cancer of the TWA acquisition, had created a corporate invalid. The first casualty of this new reality was Don Carty. The CEO who had captained the TWA disaster was forced out in 2003, not just for the merger, but for a final, tone-deaf act of corporate cynicism. While demanding, and receiving, billions in wage and benefit concessions from his pilots, flight attendants and mechanics, it was revealed that he and other top executives had secretly approved a massive multi-million-dollar retention bonus package for themselves. When the unions found out, the airline nearly imploded in a spontaneous wildcat strike. Carty was gone. His replacement was Gerard Arpey, a reserved, numbers-focused American lifer. Arpey's entire tenure as CEO, from 2003 to 2011, would be defined by a single, overriding, and ultimately fatal obsession: avoiding bankruptcy. In the early 2000s, the entire US airline industry was a hospital ward. United Airlines had collapsed into Chapter 11 in 2002. US Airways had already filed, would emerge, and then file again in 2004. Delta and Northwest would both file on the same disastrous day in 2005. RP watched his rivals, one by one, take the easy way out. He saw bankruptcy as a moral failure, a stain on the proud legacy of C.R. Smith and Robert Crandall. American, he vowed, would be the only legacy carrier to survive without filing. This proud airline narrative became the company's central identity. It was a noble, romantic, and catastrophically stupid business strategy. Because while RP was trying to patch the leaks on his 70-year-old battleship with duct tape, his competitors were in dry dock, using the power of the bankruptcy court to build brand new destroyers. When United and Delta went into Chapter 11, they didn't just get a breather from their creditors, they were given a legal superpower to systematically dismantle their past. A bankruptcy judge gave them the right to unilaterally terminate their defined benefit pension plans, dumping those multi-billion-dollar obligations onto the federal government's Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. They were allowed to rip up their ironclad union contracts, forcing their pilots and flight attendants to accept massive pay cuts and work rule changes. They shed their old, inefficient planes and their mountains of debt. They emerged from the process as lean, mean, restructured companies. American, by refusing to file, was competing with these new, low-cost legacy carriers while still shackled by every mistake from its past. The company was being crushed by a three-headed monster. First, the debt, a relentless dragon of interest payments from the TWA acquisition and the post-9/11 loans. Second, the pensions, the multi-billion-dollar unfunded liability for all the A-scale employees Robert Crandall had bought off back in 1983. Third, and most critically, labour costs. Americans' pilots, the ones who hadn't been fired in the 20,000-person layoff, were now the highest paid in the world, and they were, to put it mildly, not in a cooperative mood. The airline became a miserable place to work. The two-tier wage system had curdled into a permanent state of civil war. The customer service, once the flagship standard, became legendarily bad. Passengers called it the angry airline. The flight attendants seemed to hate the pilots hated the management, and everybody seemed to hate the customers. The planes themselves were getting old. The fleet was dominated by hundreds of aging McDonnell Douglas MD-80s, nicknamed Mad Dogs. They were loud, cramped, terrible for the environment, and as oil prices began their relentless climb, they were gas-guzzling financial anchors. And while American was busy being proud and miserable, the real low-cost carriers were eating its lunch. Southwest Airlines, with its single-plane type fleet and giddy, non-union, or at least differently unionized workforce, was invading DFW's sister airport, Lovefield. JetBlue, with its new planes and leather seats, was dominating the East Coast routes. American was a lumbering, arthritic giant, trying to swat at a swarm of hornets. As a final, grimly symbolic nail, the airline even abandoned its iconic look. C.R. Smith's signature polished aluminum skin, a look that saved the weight and cost of paint for 70 years, was phased out. The official reason was that new composite planes like the Boeing 787s the airline dreamed of one day buying couldn't be polished. But the real reason was that polishing the old planes was labour-intensive and expensive. The new livery was a flat, dull, joyless grey paint. The airline, in its depression, had literally let itself go. Then, in 2008, the global financial system imploded. The price of jet fuel spiked to an unheard of $147 a barrel. Business travel, which had only partially recovered from 9/11, vanished completely. For American, this was the end of the line. The proud airline was now, undeniably, the industry's sick man. It was losing hundreds of millions of dollars every quarter. It was clear to everyone, to Wall Street, to its unions, to its employees, that RP's pride strategy had failed. He was just steering the Titanic 100 miles closer to its destination before it hit the iceberg. The final standoff came with the pilots' union, the APA. Management came to them in 2011, desperate for one last massive round of concessions. The pilots, looking at their colleagues at the newly merged Delta Northwest and United Continental, refused. They knew what would happen. They would give up their pay, and the executives would get bonuses. They called the company's bluff. They held the line, and the line broke. On November 29, 2011, the company was out of cash. Gerard Arpey, in a final proud act, resigned. His replacement, Thomas Horton, had one job. That same morning, American Airlines, the last and largest of the Big Four, the airline of C.R. Smith and Robert Crandall, the flagship of the skies, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Bankruptcy experts still debate whether American's 2011 filing was a tragic, inevitable failure of a legacy business model, or a necessary and colossally overdue strategic tool that management had simply refused to use out of sheer hubris. The truth was, it was too late. American was now at the mercy of the court and its creditors. It was wounded, it was vulnerable, and in Phoenix, a man who had been watching American's slow suicide for years was picking up his phone. American Airlines, the proud airline, was now a ward of the state. Its arrival in bankruptcy court in November 2011 was a humiliation, but for its new CEO, Thomas Horton, it was also a liberation. Horton, who had replaced the proud Gerard Arpey, was finally free to do what Arpey had refused to do for a decade. He could finally use the superpowers of Chapter 11. He immediately moved to shed the company's crushing weight. He initiated the process to terminate those billions in unfunded pension obligations, dumping them onto the federal government. He asked the bankruptcy judge to void the existing high-cost union contracts, planning to impose new, cheaper ones. And he began the work of restructuring American's massive debt. Horton's plan was clear. He would use the bankruptcy process to cleanse the airline of its past sins, just as Delta, United, and Northwest had done, and emerge as a smaller, leaner, more profitable standalone company. He had just one massive problem. He was not the only one who saw value in the wreckage. Across the country, in Tempe, Arizona, a man named Doug Parker was watching. Parker was the CEO of US Airways, and he was in many ways the anti-Horton. He was not an American Airlines lifer, steeped in the flagship culture. He was a ruthless pragmatist, a survivor, and the industry's ultimate deal-maker. His own airline, US Airways, was a Frankenstein's monster of previous mergers. Parker had started at the scrappy, low-cost America West Airlines. In 2005, he had used the America West stock and a load of new debt to execute a reverse takeover of the first US Airways, which was itself in its second bankruptcy. He had, in effect, piloted a minnow to swallow a shark. He was a man who understood, better than anyone, that in the post-9/11 airline world, you either ate or you were eaten. Parker looked at Horton's standalone plan and saw a threat. If American emerged from bankruptcy as a lean, low-cost giant, his own new US Airways, with its higher costs, would be crushed. But he also saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He couldn't just buy American. Its stock was delisted and worthless. But he could take control. He couldn't launch a traditional hostile takeover against a public company. So, he launched the first ever hostile takeover of a company in bankruptcy. His target wasn't American's management. They were irrelevant. His target was American's new owners, the Unsecured Creditors Committee. This committee, a group of hedge funds, bondholders, aircraft lessors, and the government's pension board didn't care about American's 80-year history or its polished aluminum planes. They cared about one thing, and one thing only, getting the highest possible return on the billions of dollars American owed them. Horton was offering them a standalone plan that might be valuable. Parker decided to offer them a merger that would, he promised, be far, far more valuable. To win over the creditors, Parker knew he needed a weapon. He found one in the most unlikely of places, American's own unions. This was Parker's masterstroke, a move of breathtaking cynicism and political genius. He knew that Tom Horton and his management team were, at that very moment, standing in front of a judge trying to legally gut the union's contracts, slash their pay, and terminate their pensions. The unions were terrified, furious, and felt utterly betrayed. So, Doug Parker, the CEO of a rival airline, went directly to them and made them a deal. He told the Allied Pilots Association, APA, the Association of Professional Flight Attendants, APFA, and the Transport Workers Union, TWU. Your own management is trying to destroy you. Support my bid to merge with your company. In return, I will stop the attacks. I will give you a better contract than Horton ever will. I will give you raises, and I will give you stock in the new combined company. All you have to do is go to the creditors' committee and tell them you want me." It was an act of open corporate treason, and it worked. In April 2012, the three main unions of American Airlines formed an unprecedented public alliance with Doug Parker against their own company. They took out full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. They held press conferences. They relentlessly lobbied the creditors' committee, delivering a single powerful message. Horton's standalone plan is a fantasy. If you approve it, American will emerge into a decade of labor war. We will strike. We will fight him at every turn. But if you approve the merger with US Airways, you will have labor peace and a more valuable company from day one. Tom Horton was blindsided, trapped, and utterly outmaneuvered. He was the general of an army whose soldiers were now actively negotiating his surrender with the enemy. He tried to fight back, launching his own PR campaign touting a new American that would be sleek and independent. But the creditors, the men with the actual power, were listening to the math. Parker's plan offered billions in synergies, a polite word for firing redundant corporate staff at both headquarters and consolidating routes, and most enticingly, it offered a prepackaged peace treaty with the unions. It was the safer bet. By late 2012, the creditors' committee had made its decision. They informed Horton and the bankruptcy judge that they would not approve any reorganization plan that didn't include the merger with US Airways. Horton, the man who had vowed to emerge independent, was checkmated. He was forced to the negotiating table to discuss the terms of his own execution. On Valentine's Day 2013, the deal was announced. American Airlines would merge with US Airways to create the world's largest airline. But it was a merger in name only. It was a reverse takeover. The smaller, less prestigious, but far more aggressive US Airways had swallowed the giant. Doug Parker would be the CEO of the new American Airlines Group. Tom Horton would be given a temporary face-saving title of chairman for a few months before being handed a multi-million-dollar golden parachute and shown the door. The company C.R. Smith had built, the fortress Crandall had perfected, had been captured, not by a rival, but by an insurgency, armed with hedge funds and its own mutinous unions. Bankruptcy experts and airline analysts still debate whether Parker's hostile takeover was a brilliant strategic coup that saved American from liquidation, or a predatory move that simply cobbled two mediocre, high-cost airlines together to create one giant, mediocre airline. The stage was now set for the single largest, most complex and most chaotic airline integration in the history of the world. Doug Parker had his prize. On December 9, 2013, the merger was finalized, and American Airlines Group, stock ticker AAG, was born. It was, by every conceivable metric, the largest airline on Earth. It had more planes, more employees, more routes, and more daily flights than any carrier in the history of aviation. Doug Parker, the man who had started at Little America West, was now the king of the skies, the CEO of an entity with nearly 700 destinations and over 100,000 employees. He had won the most audacious corporate raid in airline history. And now he had to govern the chaotic, furious, and broken empire he had conquered. The task ahead was not a merger, it was an exorcism. It was an attempt to smash two massive, complex, and culturally opposed companies into a single functioning entity. And it was, for the next 3 years, a masterclass in chaos. The integration of American and US Airways is a story of two primary, seemingly impossible battles. The war for the soul of the airline, fought in the pilot seniority lists, and the war for the brain of the airline, fought in the code of its computer systems. First, the people. Parker's brilliant, cynical masterstroke had been to weaponize Americans' unions against their own management. He had promised them labor peace. Now the unions had come to collect. And they discovered a horrifying truth. Parker may have signed their paychecks, but they still had to live with each other. The core problem was that this wasn't a merger of two airlines. It was a merger of 3, or maybe 4. The new US Airways was itself a barely digestible lump of two still warring factions, the East pilots from the original bankrupt US Airways and the West pilots from Parker's own America West, who were still, 8 years after their 2005 merger, fighting over seniority. Now you had to take that toxic, unresolved civil war and merge it with the 12,000 pilots of American Airlines, who, thanks to their union's deal-making, felt they were the rightful victors. The battle to create a single, joint collective bargaining agreement and most critically a joint seniority list, was not a negotiation. It was a bloodbath. A pilot's seniority number is their life. It dictates their salary, their aircraft, their base, their schedule, and whether they spend weekends with their family or on call in a hotel in Omaha. This merger meant thousands of pilots would be stapled to the bottom of other lists. Careers were made and broken not on skill or experience, but on the brutal political math of this integration. The bitterness was immediate and it was permanent. The new American was a place where for years the man in the right seat of the cockpit might be a legacy America West pilot, flying on a different pay scale and with different work rules than the man in the left seat, a legacy American pilot who in turn despised the US Airways flight attendants, who were all angry about their new, ill-fitting American uniforms. It was a dysfunctional, unhappy family, forced together in a pressurized tube, and the angry airline reputation that had plagued American in the 2000s came roaring back, now supercharged with a new, complex web of resentments. But the people, however angry, could at least be forced to fly. The computers were another matter. You cannot run a single airline on two different brains. American, as we know, ran on Sabre, the ancient, godlike, and deeply temperamental system Robert Crandall had built. US Airways ran on shares, an equally ancient and cranky system it had inherited from Continental. A choice had to be made. Parker and his team, wary of Sabre's high contract costs, made the fateful decision. The new $11 billion mega airline would run on the US Airways shares system. But to placate the public, they would call it Sabre. It was a technological bait-and-switch of terrifying complexity. This process is known as the Passenger Service System, or PSS, cutover. It is, in airline operations, the equivalent of a full-body transplant performed on a tightrope over a volcano with the patient still awake. You must, in a single night, move every active reservation, every frequent flyer account, every flight schedule, and every crew roster from one system to the other. Parker's team knew the risks. It is a grimly mainstream historical fact that the 2007 PSS cutover from the America West US Airways merger had been a legendary disaster, a meltdown nicknamed the Night of the Long Knives that stranded thousands of passengers and nearly bankrupted the company. They swore they had learned their lesson. They spent 21 months and by some estimates over $500 million planning for this one night. They built a full-scale command center in Dallas, a war room to manage the switch. They trained 50,000 gate agents, reservationists and pilots on the new interface. They set the date, October 17, 2015. Airline operations analysts still debate whether a phased PSS migration is safer than a single cutover event, but the AAG team, fearing a prolonged period of chaos, opted for the Big Bang approach. That night, the switch was flipped. US Airways flight numbers, its US designator code, and its entire reservations inventory vanished from the global travel network, replaced by the AA code. At first, there was a collective global sigh of relief. The website didn't crash. Planes were taking off. Parker, in the war room, declared victory. But the victory was premature. The chaos was not a big bang. It was a slow, agonizing bleed. The two systems which were supposed to have merged were still fighting each other. They were talking, but in different languages. The glitches started small, then cascaded. The crew scheduling system, based in one legacy world, would fail to update the reservation system based in the new world. This meant pilots and flight attendants were showing up for planes that weren't at the gate, or planes, would be ready to go with no crew to fly them. The weight and balance system, a quirky but essential piece of software, began sending corrupted data to pilots. The computer, confused about whether it was calculating the weight for a legacy US Airways Airbus or a legacy American Boeing 737, would simply freeze, forcing pilots to do the complex payload math by hand on the tarmac while passengers fumed. For the gate agents, it was a nightmare. They were facing a new, unfamiliar interface that was slow, buggy, and prone to crashing. Check-in kiosks failed. The Advantage database in its migration had corrupted thousands of accounts, demoting executive platinum members to no status or wiping out their hard-earned miles. The airline's on-time performance, which had been improving, fell off a cliff. For the next year, American Airlines, the world's largest, was now, statistically, the world's worst. It led the industry in delays, cancellations, and customer complaints. Doug Parker had his giant. He had created the mega carrier he'd always dreamed of, but it was a clumsy, broken, and deeply dysfunctional giant. He had won the war, but he was losing the peace. The synergies he had promised to Wall Street were being incinerated daily in a bonfire of operational meltdowns, customer refunds, and union overtime pay. He had built the biggest airline in the world just in time for it to become the biggest target. The integration, as it turned out, would never truly end. The operational chaos of the 2015 cutover was not a temporary fever. It was the onset of a chronic, debilitating condition. Doug Parker, the master dealmaker, had successfully built the world's largest airline. But he and his team, mostly legacy America West executives who had never run a global mega carrier, were now proving to be far less adept at actually running it. The company was a behemoth, a giant with two different nervous systems, a legacy American brain and a legacy US Airways brain, and the signals were constantly getting crossed. For the rest of the decade, American Airlines was defined by this internal clumsiness. It consistently lagged behind its newly streamlined rivals Delta and United in every key operational metric. Its on-time performance was poor, its cancellation rates were high, its baggage handling was a mess, and its reputation, once flagship, was now synonymous with operational breakdowns and grumpy employees. The angry airline moniker, born in the 2000s, was back with a vengeance. The deep-seated resentment from the seniority list integration had festered, creating a workforce that felt betrayed by the very man who had promised them salvation. This was tragically illustrated by the great uniform debacle of 2016. The company, in an attempt to create a single, unified look for its new 100,000-strong workforce, rolled out new, sophisticated grey and blue uniforms. The rollout was a public relations catastrophe. Within weeks, thousands of flight attendants began reporting bizarre, terrifying medical reactions to the new clothes. They complained of rashes, hives, headaches, and most frighteningly, severe respiratory distress. The new uniforms, it turned in, were, for many, toxic. The ensuing fight, with the flight attendants union demanding a full recall and the company initially dragging its feet, became a perfect toxic metaphor for the entire merger. A new, shiny exterior that was literally poisoning its own people. Despite this internal chaos, the airline was, on paper, wildly profitable. The mid-2010s were a golden age for the entire industry, a bubble of prosperity driven by a perfect storm of a booming global economy, massive travel demand, and, most importantly, the collapse of oil prices. Jet fuel, the single biggest expense for any airline, was cheap. For a few short years, every airline was a cash machine. But here, the philosophies of the big three diverged. Delta, flush with cash, poured its billions into upgrading its passenger experience. New state-of-the-art terminals, free Wi-Fi, better food, and a relentless focus on its premium brand. United, under its new CEO Oscar Munoz, was investing in its Polaris business class and trying to repair its own toxic labour culture. American, under Parker, did something else. Parker, the finance guy, the man who had built his empire on leveraged buyouts, knew what his company really was. It was a high-cost, high-debt entity that had just been given a temporary economic reprieve. Analysts still debate if the post-merger AAG was a true synergistic success, or just a high-cost entity being floated by a historically strong economic tide. Parker's actions suggest he believed the latter. His primary overriding strategy was not to invest in the product, it was to delever. He used every spare billion in cash from the cheap fuel boom to aggressively pay down the toxic debt he had incurred to take over American in the first place. It was a race against time. He knew this golden age wouldn't last, and he had to get the company's horrifying balance sheet in order before the next crisis hit. He almost made it. By the beginning of 2020, the debt was down to a more manageable level. The airline, while still clumsy, was at least on a stable financial footing. The integration was, if not complete, at least permanent. Parker was preparing to hand the reins to his longtime lieutenant, Robert Crandall, and then the world ended. The COVID-19 pandemic was not a recession. It was an extinction-level event. It was not a 9/11-style shock. It was a 9/11 that happened every single day for an entire year. Global travel didn't just fall, it ceased to exist. In April 2020, American Airlines revenue dropped by 95%. The company, which had been designed to fly 200 million people a year, was flying planes with 6 passengers. This is where the debt, the one thing Parker had been fighting, finally became the executioner. Of the big 3, American was by far the most exposed. It had the highest debt load and the thinnest cash reserves. As revenue vanished, Parker, like his predecessors, was forced to go to the US government, hat in hand. The CARES Act bailout, a $50 billion lifeline for the industry, saved the company from immediate liquidation, but the price was astronomical. American, in order to survive, had to take on billions more in high-interest government loans. In a few short months, Parker's entire decade of deleveraging was wiped out, replaced by a new, more terrifying mountain of public debt. The airline was, once again, the sick man of the industry. In 2022, Doug Parker finally retired. He handed the title of CEO to Robert Crandall. Isom, the ultimate operations guy, inherited the modern behemoth. He's the steward of the largest airline in the world, an entity that C.R. Smith could never have fathomed. But this behemoth is a fragile, brittle thing. It is defined, more than anything else, by the largest debt load in the history of global aviation, a sum north of $40 billion. It is a giant that must earn over $15 million in pure profit every single day, just to pay the interest on its past mistakes, before it can even think about buying a new plane or giving a customer a better meal. The airline we see today is a living museum of its own history. It is a patchwork quilt, just as it was in 1930, but the patches are now the size of entire airlines. The old American, the angry TWA, the forgotten Reno Air, the proud US Airways, the scrappy America West. It is held together by Robert Crandall's data, but that data is now ancient and buggy. It is haunted by the ghosts of Flight 191 and Flight 77. And it is shackled by the financial decisions of every CEO who ever sat in the big chair. It is a story not of a rise and a fall, but of a constant, painful, chaotic, and somehow glorious cycle of survival. A silver giant, forever flying and forever on the brink. And so, the great silver jet, this modern behemoth, continues its journey through the night sky. It carries all of its ghosts with it. The daring male pilots in their open cockpits, the glamorous stewardesses of the flagship fleet, the frantic analysts in Crandall's war room, all of them, a silent crew on a flight that never truly lands. The airline is a testament to a simple human truth, that we will endure almost any cost, any chaos, any debt, for the miracle of climbing above the clouds, of leaving one world and arriving just a few hours later in another. The hum of the engines, that deep reassuring vibration, is the sound of a century of ambition, a sound that has cost so much in treasure and in tears. But tonight its only job is to be a soft, steady rhythm, a background hum to ease you into your rest. The story is over, the battles are finished, the debts are for another day. All that matters now is the smooth air at 30,000 feet and the quiet of the darkened cabin. It's time to let the story fade, to let the details blur, and to let your own mind drift away, to let go and just sleep.